Well, I'll talk about a few basic settings to start. So one of them is the red wax material. It's kind of like a joke in the ZBrush community. It's been like the standard starting material in ZBrush for a long time. I find it can actually obscure a lot when you're trying to build something or model something. So for me, my preference is often to actually work or start in the green metallic material. So you can switch the material by just clicking on it and then picking one and say save as startup material. So that'll be like every time you restart ZBrush, it'll be that material that starts. In general, I recommend switching between materials because each material has its own kind of like little lighting effects or ways of seeing the surface. And it's good to be sort of constantly changing that and challenging that. I think it's very helpful. Another thing I want to talk about, so if you're starting in a project window or the tool palette, it doesn't really matter which. The tools for some reason are all in the red wax. I think it's because they date back to older versions of ZBrush. When you start a project, they have more of the gray material applied to start. So if you're in the project window and you start that way, it's going to kind of wipe out all the settings and start from a fresh, clean starting point. So a few things to be aware of. In the upper left corner of ZBrush, so right here, you'll see the active points and total points. So active points is the subtool that you're on, and total points is the total number of vertices basically that are in effect. And the way I like to categorize ZBrush is that there's, I think, really two, maybe three major categories of the types of mesh you can handle or that you're going to deal with. So when you load, if you go into Lightbox with the comma key and you load the dynamesh sphere, what is happening is that it is automatically loading a tool. If you look over on the right side of ZBrush under Geometry, Dynamesh, this little button is active. So what's actually happening is that it's going to come in from 6 sides, the front, the back, top, bottom, left, and right, and with a grid of a certain resolution, which is that resolution slider below, it's going to come in from all 6 sides and just cut into the mesh evenly so that there's an even distribution of polys. The reason this is important is that let's say you're experimenting. So if I go to B for brush, M for move, and I want to pull out something from this mesh, you can see at a certain point, it sort of reaches its limits and it really starts stretching out, right? So when this button is on, if you click it, you're out of Dynamesh mode. When you click it, you're activating it. Okay, so if I want to pull more mesh, right? If I want to keep pulling and you see it's stretching so badly, if this button is on, you have to control left click and drag, okay? So what it's going to do is evenly chop up that mesh. So then you can start to sculpt it and pull out more mesh from there. So it's great for creating new legs, arms. If you're experimenting and just pulling random shapes, it's good to kind of give you more mesh to play with so you don't hit this limit of being stuck with only so much mesh. When you control click and drag off the model, it'll kind of mesh it, remesh it, or redynamesh it. Now, one thing just to point out is that, yeah, this thing, it's great, especially for kind of concept work, but it's not necessarily something that you can use inside of Maya or another 3D package where you may want to animate and do UVs and stuff like that. So typically the workflow for me is when you're doing something that you're just kind of roughing out, I keep the resolution fairly low. And this would count for more organic stuff or even the environments. I keep the Dynamesh low, and when you're done dynameshing and pulling your basic shape out, turn it off. Close the little panel, left click and go to ZBrush, and you can actually create new topology that's clean with cleaner and simpler edges. So you set your poly count in the 1,000. So this, let's say I want it to be 1,000 roughly. Hit ZBrush, and it's, you know, oftentimes going to one-click generate new, fairly good clean topology based on the shapes that it can view. So it's really, really useful. So that's what I mean when there's sort of like 2 or 3 categories of mesh. There's basically the more disorganized Dynamesh, which is great for just kind of feeling your way through something, figuring out the early stages, and even, you know, you can go into the millions of polys with Dynamesh. I know some artists that they do more high-level conceptual work, and they almost never, they may start low, but they rarely ZBrush, or if they do, it's for some simple mechanical parts. So that's Dynamesh and ZBrush. Now there's kind of a third component to this that I'm going to mention, and you don't have to activate Dynamesh for this. There's something called Sculptress Pro. So let me go back to the simple sphere just to show you guys this. If I'm using a standard brush, okay, and I'm sculpting on the surface, right? It's just, and I'm hitting Shift F, by the way. Shift F is Polyframe, which is this button on the far right side. So Polyframe, okay? You can click on that or hit Shift F. I often use it so I can sort of see where I'm rotating, where I'm moving. And by the way, if you lose symmetry, symmetry is X. If you hit X, it should show a second red dot. So you may need to kind of rotate around the object until you see the second red dot. But symmetry is simply X to turn off and on. So the next thing is this thing called Sculptress. Sculptress was only added, I think, in 2018, one of the last versions of Zbrush. And what it does, this is localized tessellation. So as you add detail, it's adding new edges. So the smaller the brush, the more dense that detail is going to be in what's added. So it's almost like localized dynamesh in a way. It's sort of like it. It's not exactly the same, but it's really interesting. I still find it can be a little unstable. I haven't really tested it extensively in 2019, but in 2018 it can be very laggy, so you want to be a bit careful with it. But I think in 2019 it's probably been optimized quite a bit more. So as you sculpt more detail with Sculptress Pro on, this little button here, you don't need to dynamesh to add more polys. So if I use, let's say, the Dam Standard, which is a groove brush, and I hit Shift F, so you can see that as I cut these grooves into the surface, it's adding local increased poly count, right? Now what's interesting too is if you hold Shift and smooth, it reduces poly count where it's not needed. So as those details melt away, so does the density of the mesh. So really, really interesting software for a lot of creative reasons. Like I feel as though Zbrush really just unleashes creativity. It's a very incredible software. So you can combine Dynamesh and Sculptress Pro, which is what that button is at the top. You can just do Sculptress Pro. So I'll show you a project that I started with Sculptress Pro. So I was literally just pulling things out with Sculptress Pro here. So, and then I think I also Dynameshed at some point. And then I went more into Dynamesh and just simply had a higher res Dynamesh, and I evolved it into this, right? So you can do some really, really incredible stuff with those creative tools. And you know, when you're ready to get a more organized mesh, it's really almost as simple as going into, turning off Sculptress Pro if you're using that, turning off Dynamesh if you're using that. For me, the main tool or the main process to get to a more organized mesh is to duplicate it. So if my sculpting's done, I duplicate, and then I can go to Geometry, Z-Remesh. And this is something I can then export to Maya. So, you set your poly count. So let's say 1 for 1000. Hit Z-Remesh. It's going to recalculate the topology. Now there are deeper functionality inside of Z-Remesher. There's guides you can put in. You can use something called polygroups, and I'll come back around to polygroups in a little bit. Okay, so if I solo, there's a little solo button, so you can see now I've got this new kind of mesh based on that sculpting, but you see it doesn't have the detail, right? So if I switch back to the other one has so much more detail, right? So what do we do here? This is when you switch to a more organized mesh. Well, you go back into geometry, and at the top you can divide this thing once, twice, maybe 3 times. I usually divide it until I roughly hit the same poly count as my Dynamesh slash Sculptress model. So this one is the Sculptress Dynamesh, and this is the smoothed model, right? So this is the base, and then divide it a bunch so it's smooth. Now what you can do is actually capture the detail from one version to the other by going into Subtools. So Subtools is a spot where you can add additional tools or split tools off of your model. It's a way to organize a big project. So it's kind of like in Maya when you have multiple pieces attached to one object. So let's say you build a car, you build the base with a box, then you build the wheels with cylinders. You can either group them or you can combine them into the mesh, but they're still kind of technically separate and floating. And that's what Subtools does, is it allows you to kind of have multiple tools within one project. In this case, I've got a clone, so I can copy detail from one to the other. So if I select the new clean copy with its different divisions, I can go to project, project all, and it's literally going to wrap itself around in high accuracy to that original mesh. So I don't have the chaotic mesh that's here. I've got a clean mesh with a lower resolution here. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is that, let's say I go to brush. I mentioned in the last segment here that if you go to brush and you go to standard brush, you can turn off Z add and turn on RGB. There's actually a bit of an easier way to do this, which is to go to B for brush, P for paint, and there's already basically a standard brush with the sculpting turned off and the painting turned on. So let's say I go in. If you hit a color, automatically it's going to fill the object with that color. So if you want a certain base color, you can go to that color. As long as RGB is active on whatever brush is active, you can go to color, fill object, and now I can go in and paint with other colors. So let's say I put some color down here, okay? It's not the greatest paint job, but you get the idea. So I'm doing this on the disorganized mesh. And remember, I can go back to this mesh and project it. And it's going to ask me, do you want to transfer the poly painting data as well? And I'm going to say, yes, I want the poly paint data. Now, if you notice, this mesh is low resolution. I'm at the lowest subdivision of this new clean mesh. The way Zbrush allows you to paint without UVs is that it looks at the vertice, and the vertice holds color information. So if I go up to the higher resolution version of this and reproject, it's going to bring back that sharper, clearer version of that. So to show you maybe on here, if I switch my paintbrush to a drag type and put in a texture of some kind, like the jelly beans, right? If I drag that out, when you drag it out on a very low resolution area, it looks very pixelated, and that's because the vertices are acting as pixels in a way. Whereas if I went to my higher res model and dragged it out, it might look a little sharper. Or if I go into a higher division level, I can get way more kind of sharper pixel information from that texture. Now, one of the genius things about Zbrush, I mentioned this in the last segment as well, is that we've got categories of brushes, okay? So if I click on the brush menu and hit S for smooth, we've actually got different types of smoothing brushes. So if you click on smooth peaks, it's going to tell you this brush will become the new smoothing brush when you hit shift. I'll say okay. So when I hold shift, it's going to smooth only the peaks on this model, which there aren't a ton. If again I go into B for brush, S for smooth, smooth valleys, it's warning me again. But if I hold smooth, right, hold shift and smooth, it's only smoothing out the valley regions of the sculpt, which almost gives it like a desert sort of look where things are kind of swept into the crevices or the creases. So that's another interesting functionality in Zbrush. The main reason I'm bringing this up, and I'm going to come around to this, is let's say you want a different type of masking brush. If you go to the brush palette again and hit M for masking, there's actually a mask pen, a mask lasso instead of pen. So if you hold control now, it gives you the warning again. Control, click and drag allows you to mask via, right, via a lasso. So now I could maybe fill this with a totally different color. Oops, got my jelly beans on. I'll turn them off so I can fill that with just that color and clear the mask. Now, remember I mentioned Control Shift. It's select rectangle, which allows you to hide and unhide parts of a model, right? I often personally switch it to one other type of brush. So there's select rectangle, select lasso, which I prefer to rectangle. So I often will switch to select lasso, and it'll tell me again, Control Shift will now activate this brush, right? So if I select and isolate based on this, now I can kind of hide and unhide. Or if I hold Control Shift Alt, I can hide or unhide parts of the mesh this way too, right? To go a little bit further into that, there are sort of three main brushes I use within the Control Shift alternate brush, which is a select brush. There's actually some additional kind of cutting tools. There's clip curve. So C for clip curve, and it's right here. And it warns me again, Control Shift will activate this. What click curve does is really interesting. It just allows you to kind of flatten a part of a mesh or slice it cleanly. Technically, it's not slicing it, it's just flattening it against that curve. And if you Control Shift click, let go of Control Shift, keep holding your left button, Alt click once gives you a curve, twice, sharp line. Now, sometimes you get little weird bugs like this if you're really pushing the profile, but it's an interesting way to get some new shapes into your mesh. I'm going to switch my subtool for a second. If you want to slice the object into different parts or components, you can go to B for brush. There's slice curve and trim curve. So slice, I'll say okay to that. What it's actually going to do is kind of cut a new line into this, but you see the color coding actually changed on the mesh, right? So we do it something like this. It's slicing a new edge through the model, but then it's splitting it into what are known as polygroups. Now, why are polygroups important? I will come back to this in a minute. So I'll come back to the trim curve. So trim curve, like I said, it cuts into the mesh and it creates a new polygroup. That's slice curve, sorry. Trim curve will actually cut the piece off and give you a new polygroup where that kind of opening would be. I use this a lot for damage. So you see I had a color as well on my paintbrush, so it actually put that color in. But normally if you had no color on your brush, it would just automatically generate a new polygroup. So polygrouping, this is a unique functionality. So what's great about polygroups is that if you Control Shift click on the group, you can isolate it. If you Control Shift click on it again, you can hide it. That's one simple aspect to polygroups. If you want to create polygroups, so this is different than polypaint. Paint is like the actual color on the surface. Polygroups, so I'm going to turn off polypaint here real quick. Polygroups is essentially a color coding in the mesh that you can then use for different things. So this is my new version of this model, right? This is my old version. Let's say I want to unwrap this thing and send it to Maya. So if I go down to low res here, what I could do, is I'm going to switch back to my select rectangle. Select rectangle, there we go. And if I just kind of grab roughly the bottom half of this mesh, hit Control W, it's going to give me a new polygroup. Like I said, polypainting can sometimes interfere with the visibility of this, but if I turn that off temporarily, the colorize button under polypaint, I can see there's two groupings now, right? So I see two groupings. That's really, really useful, right? Why is it useful? Well, I can go to Z plugin, for example, and go to UV master. And I can say, let's use the polygroup information to unwrap this thing. So I'll click on unwrap, and it's literally a 2-click unwrap. If I work on a copy of this and flatten it, this is what the UVs look like, right? Now, let's say if I go back to sort of this object where I've sliced it, it's asymmetrical, it's kind of in a weird shape. Maybe I'll sort of scrap this other copy that I have. So I'll hit Shift F. I'll just turn off the line display so we can just see the polygroup information, right? So let's say I duplicate this again because I'm going to remesh it, right? Because these are the lines for it. If you go to Geometry, Z Remesh, there's an option in here called Keep Groups. Now, when you, just as a word of warning, when you remesh, especially something like this that's asymmetrical, you want to turn off symmetry so it doesn't fully and symmetrically copy itself over, because you'll get that slice kind of on both sides. So it's going to take a second to calculate, but it's going to take that change in polygroup into effect and try to keep that border intact. It did its best, right, to kind of maintain that. And I could actually keep remeshing this as well. So if I remesh again, it may give me a slightly cleaner result, right? And then remember, I could project. So this is the new copy. This is the original. And I'll turn back on my poly paint so we can see that, right? So there's some painting information. It's white here, orange here, green here, right? So if I project all, yes, I want to transfer the data. I have to divide it probably again. So that's Control D, divide it. Maybe increase my distance so I can catch more of that shape, a little more. divide it again, project, divide. So I usually divide and project as I go. And now I've got this new model that's got cleaner mesh. It's got a base I can use in Maya, right? And if I take this, remember, Z plugin, turn on polygroups here. Z plugin, UV master, turn on polygroups, hit Unwrap. I'm going to work on a clone and flatten it. And there's my UVs, like magic, right? So now I mentioned earlier the Z tool palette. I usually save here. So I would save this as a Z tool, ZTL file. And I usually number them, give them a very simple name, number them, keep them organized. You can as well export and import OBJ files. It's a universal model format. What's even better though is actually having this thing called GoZ. So when you first click on GoZ, it's going to ask you to install plugins for your other 3D software that may or may not be installed. So right now Maya is launching. I often find this version of ZBrush, actually this version should be okay. 2018 ZBrush and 2018 Maya don't necessarily play together well, but you can see the meshes in here, right? But I want to bring the other information in, right? So I've got high-res sculpting. Why do I have it? So I can probably make something like a normal map, okay? So the high-res looks like this. The low-res looks like this. If I go to, first I start at UV map, set it to 4K. If I go to texture map, I'm going to go all the way to the high-res. Go to create from Polypaint. It's going to respect the UVs, capture the painting information. If I go to normal map, I have to go to my lowest subdivision, create a normal map there, and you see the sculpting information shows up. If I hit GoZ again, one click, might take a second for Maya to update. Actually, I think I'm still getting some quirks between these two, but we'll see. I'll hit 6 on my keyboard. Ah, there we go. So the texture showed up, right? The information's there. And if I go to the attribute editor, usually I like to switch my material to something like a blend, so it's a little bit shiny. And I often have to make sure my normal map is set up to raw. So technically this is the low res, super low poly model at 860 faces. If I hit 3 to smooth it, it looks smoother than it is because it is doing a smooth preview. And that normal map is faking a lot of the surface detail, right? So that's the real power of ZBrush, is that we can very quickly create new objects, new shapes, use polygroups, use dynamesh and Z-remesh to quickly create new organic and inorganic models. Okay.